Anfield, Liverpool, 1931. Tonight we journey back to examine one of the strangest murder mysteries of all time. It was the murder of Julia Wallace. Dubbed the Impossible Murder, it remains unsolved to this day. January the 20th, 1931, Wolverton Street, Anfield. Amidst a sea of red terraced houses, Julia Wallace, a 69-year-old amateur musician, is found brutally beaten to death in the parlour of her home. A 52-year-old male named William Herbert Wallace, Julia's husband, is quickly arrested and sentenced to death for murder. But nothing about this case would prove to be simple. Welcome to Mysteries Retold. The day before the brutal murder that shocked the area, January the 19th, 1931, William Wallace had gone to the City Cafe located in Liverpool's business district. He was attending his weekly chess club meeting. He was scheduled to compete in a tournament that evening. Upon his arrival, the chess captain approaches him with a strange message. 20 minutes earlier, the cafe had received a phone call for Wallace. The caller identified himself as Mr. R.M. Qualtrough. He's requested to meet Wallace the following evening at 7:30 p.m. to discuss an urgent insurance matter, and the meeting was to take place at 25 Menlove Gardens East. William's puzzled. He didn't know anyone by that name, and nor did he recognise this address. Nevertheless, he jots down the details in his notebook, first writing 25 Menlove Gardens West, before striking through West and replacing it with East. William puts this strange message to the back of his head, and then completes chess club on the evening of January the 19th. The following day, the day of the murder, January the 20th, William again goes about his day as usual. By all accounts, William is a well-liked and respected man. He's known for his quiet demeanour. He's a passionate chess player and a budding violinist, which he learned to play alongside his wife. He's an amateur chemistry teacher and a lover of philosophy. On the 20th, friends and clients alike interacted with him throughout the day, later stating that William seemed his usual self, calm and pleasant. That evening, with the strange meeting with Mr. Qualtrough going through William's head, he arrives home just after 6 o'clock, and he has tea with Julia and rests briefly before setting out at 6:45 to try and get to the bottom of the strange note he'd received the night before. He takes a tram towards Menlove Gardens after leaving his house. Wallace began what would become a bizarre and fruitless journey. Upon arrival, he discovers that Menlove Gardens East does not exist. The area had a north, south and west, but no Menlove Gardens East. He's confused. Wallace asks several passers-by for assistance, but no one can locate the address. He looks back at his notepad and remembers he crossed out west for east. So, assuming now he'd made an error, he heads to 25 Menlove Gardens West. But the woman who answers the door there says she's never heard of Mr. Qualtrough. Wallace then even stops and speaks to a police officer who confirms that Menlove Gardens East does not exist. Wallace then gives up on finding this Mr. Qualtrough. He concludes this is likely a prank, an elaborate prank by a friend at the chess club. Wallace heads home. Eventually Wallace returns to Wolverton Street and things take a grim turn. His front door would not open and the house is eerily dark. A neighbour, Mr. Johnson, happens to be passing by with his wife and stops to check on Wallace. Wallace explains to them the problems he's having and decides to enter through the back door while the Johnsons wait out the front. Moments later, William Wallace emerges pale and frantic. He's shouting, "Come and see, they've killed her." The Johnsons follow Wallace inside, where they're met with a horrifying scene. Julia's lifeless body lay in the parlour at the front of the house. She's been savagely beaten and is lying on a blood-soaked coat that belonged to Wallace. William breaks down in tears, and Mr. Johnson runs to find a police officer. When the police arrive, they quickly confirm Julia's dead. Her body was still warm. The scene was strange. £4 was missing from a cash box, but this £4 had been moved from the cash box and placed in a kitchen cupboard. A wad of blood-stained pound notes was also discovered, as well as traces of blood within the toilet basin. Julia's handbag remained untouched. There were no signs of forced entry, and not really any signs of robbery. The only other irregularity was clothing that had been strewn about the bedroom. 2 police pathologists arrived to examine Julia's body. One estimated her time of death to be about 8 p.m, while the other officer, the official police surgeon, claimed that she'd probably died closer to 6. In 1931, forensic science relied heavily on signs of rigor mortis and body temperature to predict the time of death. An imperfect method, but the best available in these circumstances. If Julia had died at 6 p.m, Wallace would have been home at that time, making him the prime suspect. He was arrested immediately. At the station, Wallace was thoroughly examined. Strangely, not a single trace of blood was found on his clothing or person, a fact that baffled investigators given the violent nature of this attack. The police also later determined that the mysterious phone call from Qualtrough had been made from a phone box just 100 yards from Wallace's home. They quickly concluded that Wallace himself had orchestrated the call to establish an alibi. It seems an open and shut case. But as they sought to close this investigation, the mystery only deepens. More information emerges, and cracks begin to form in the police's theory. The day after the murder, a local milk boy named Alan Close came forward with a critical statement. Close was certain that he'd seen Julia Wallace alive and well shortly after 6:30 p.m, but no later than 6:45. He was working his route at the time and keeping a close eye on his schedule, and he vividly remembers seeing Julia that evening. His account was corroborated by other witnesses, making it a significant piece of evidence. And here's why it matters. If Julia was alive at 6:45 p.m, and William boarded his tram at 7:06 p.m. to meet Qualtrough, this would leave him just 21 minutes to carry out the crime. In that narrow window, Wallace would have had to have murdered Julia in a violent attack, clean himself thoroughly, change his clothes, stage the scene, and walk 1/3 of a mile to catch the tram. Now, even more damning to the police's timeline was Wallace's well-known physical condition. Due to the removal of one of his kidneys, he moved slowly and carefully, making the already implausible timeline even less likely. The police, however, were determined to fit the facts to their theory. They accused Alan Close of lying, or bizarrely suggested that Wallace had disguised himself as Julia, possibly wearing a dress, to fool the milk boy. It seems a bit desperate and highly improbable. If Wallace had premeditated this murder, some argue it wouldn't have really taken that long to carry out. However, forensic examiners concluded that the murderer would have been drenched in blood after such a brutal attack. Yet, when William was examined by police, not a single drop of blood was found on him, his clothes, or his belongings. The police counter with another theory. They suggest that Wallace had committed the murder while completely naked, wearing only the jacket that was found underneath Julia's body. The idea raised as many questions as it answered. For instance, no murder weapon was ever found, though the couple's cleaner noted that a fire poker was missing from the house. William denied this claim, which adds further ambiguity to the case. On April 22, 1931, William Wallace stood trial for the murder of his wife. The evidence against him was entirely circumstantial. No physical proof tied him to the crime, yet the court of public opinion had already turned against him. Local newspapers, fed information by the police, painted Wallace guilty long before the trial began. The jury was selected from areas outside of Liverpool. They deliberated for just 1 hour before reaching their final verdict. Guilty. William Herbert Wallace was sentenced to death. But this still isn't the end of the story. William Wallace took his case to the Court of Criminal Appeal in London, where his conviction was ultimately overturned. He returned to Liverpool as a free man, but freedom came with a heavy price. His clients turned against him, mocking him in the streets, and the stigma of the crime followed him everywhere. On February 26, 1933, Wallace died of complications from the kidney issues that had plagued him all his life. He died a broken man, and he was buried alongside Julia in Anfield Cemetery. So if Wallace didn't kill Julia, who did? One name that has surfaced over the years is Richard Parry, a 22-year-old former colleague of Wallace, and Parry was a familiar face at the City Cafe where Wallace played chess, and he would have known Wallace's schedule. Wallace himself once said, "If Parry had called, my wife would not have hesitated to let him in." Parry also had a motive. Wallace had caught him stealing money from other clients. Additionally, Parry was well acquainted with Wolverton Street, having done collections there on Wallace's behalf during a period of illness in 1928. Parry knew where Wallace's cash box was kept, and he would have known that Tuesday evening was payday. This was when the most money would have been held in the cash box. The murder occurred on a Tuesday evening. Parry's actions raise eyebrows. Years later, in the 1960s, he reportedly admitted to frequently visiting the Wallace's home to sing for Julia. Seems to be a detail that William never knew. Moreover, Parry lied to the police about his whereabouts on the night of the mysterious Qualtrough call. He claimed he was with his girlfriend, Lily Lloyd, but years later again, Lily confesses to Wallace's solicitor that this alibi was false. Another odd detail came from a local garage employee named John Parks. Parks claimed that on the night of the murder, Parry showed up and demanded that his car be cleaned thoroughly, inside and out. And during the cleaning, Parks said that he found a bloody glove in one of the compartments. Adding to this mystery, Wallace's neighbours, the Johnsons, reported hearing two loud thuds from the house at 8:30 p.m, while neighbours on the other side of the building claim they heard similar thuds at 6:30 p.m. Despite these suspicious details, Parry had another alibi for the time of the murder. He claimed to have been at Olivia Bryne's house between 5:30 and 8:30 p.m, and police-stated witnesses also confirmed this. However, those witness reports were never released to the public. It's possible Parry's second alibi could also have been fabricated. But the police appeared confident it wasn't him, possibly because they were too fixated on Wallace. There's even a theory to suggest that Parry's father, an official in the Liverpool Corporation, may have influenced the investigation. However, this is conspiracy, and we won't go into that today. So, could it have been Parry? Well, maybe. But could it have been Wallace? Maybe. This case has earned its title as the Impossible Murder, not because it was the work of a criminal mastermind, but because it was so chaotic that applying logic just doesn't work. The detective novelist Raymond Chandler famously said, "I call it the Impossible Murder because Wallace couldn't have done it, but neither could anyone else." Circumstantial evidence swirls around this case. If Parry committed the crime, why did he leave money scattered around the house, moving it but not taking it? Why did he ignore Julia's handbag entirely? And if Wallace was guilty, why go to such lengths to create a convoluted alibi? The phone call from Qualtrough came from a booth just 400 yards from Wallace's home, and though Wallace never answered the call himself, the convenience of it all does feel like a classic alibi hoax. There's also the matter of the blood found in the toilet basin. Wallace, after his initial questioning, was adamant about returning home, but police refused. Could he have washed his hands after the murder in the basin and forgot to flush? But then, there's lack of motive here. Wallace stood to gain about £20 from Julia's life insurance. It's hardly a significant sum, and that money would have gone directly towards his defence costs. Wallace's diary, both before and after the murder, spoke lovingly of Julia. His colleagues, family, and even Julia's sister stood by him throughout it all, convinced of his innocence. No matter how this case is framed, it remains impossible to untangle. Evidence pointing to Wallace's guilt can just as easily suggest his innocence. But what's certain here is that the case ended 2 lives. Julia's in a brutal and senseless murder, and William's through the unbearable weight of accusation and public scorn. Who was Qualtrough? Why did this murder happen? And who really killed Julia Wallace? Sadly, it seems, we will never know.